Well, good evening. We are continuing our series through Acts of the Apostles and learning some lessons from Acts. And this evening we're going to be in chapter 24. And as we've done each week through this series, I want to remind us of the captions for each chapter. And you remember that the captions coincide with the alphabet. So chapter 1 begins with the letter A, chapter 2 begins with the letter B, and so on. And so just as a reminder of these captions, Acts chapter 1 is Ascension, Apostle Appointed. Acts chapter 2 is Birthday of the Church. Acts chapter 3 is Cripple Cured. Acts chapter 4 is Disciples Detained. Acts chapter 5 is Each Lied, Each Died. Acts chapter 6 is Fellows Full of Faith, Face of an Angel. Acts chapter 7 is Godly Gentleman Gains Glory. Acts chapter 8 is Here is Water. Acts chapter 9 is Saul's eyes blinded, Dorcas's eyes open. Acts chapter 10 is Journey to Joppa to get a Jew. Acts chapter 11 is Knowledge Knits Kingdom. Acts chapter 12 is Liberated, Lost Lives. Acts chapter 13 is Missionary Men Marching. Acts chapter 14 is the End, with the letter N being used here. The End, E-N-D. Acts chapter 15 is Old is Over. Acts chapter 16 is Paul preaching on to Philippi. Acts chapter 17, Quick Exits, God's Questioned. Acts chapter 18 is Roman meets Romans. Acts chapter 19 is Seven Sons of Sceva and Silver Shrines. Acts chapter 20 is Tumble from the Top at Troas, Tearful Goodbye. Acts chapter 21 is Up to Jerusalem, Upstairs. Acts chapter 22 is Vision Reviewed. Acts chapter 23 is Warned and Whisked Away. And now, Acts chapter 24 is the letter X. So Acts chapter 24 is simply the name Felix, with the X being a capital X to indicate that this is the letter. Felix is Acts chapter 24, and for obvious reasons. And so what we see in the beginning of Acts chapter 24 is Paul as he is before Felix at Caesarea. Now you remember Paul has been taken from Jerusalem to Caesarea, to the governor, to Felix, where he is awaiting his hearing, as it were. And Felix is waiting on those accusers to arrive before he hears Paul's case. Well, chapter 24, this happens. So let's begin reading in verse 1 of Acts chapter 24. Luke writes, "And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul." That's verse 1. Now, this is what Felix was waiting on, those accusers to come and make their case against Paul. Well, we're told that Ananias, who was the high priest, we're told that some of the elders, and a spokesman. Now, this is a word that we would also understand the word orator. He is someone who is well versed in speaking. So he would be very smooth in his communication. And so they have tapped him on the shoulder and said, "We want you to speak on our behalf, and we're going to tell you, here's what we desire for you to say." And so he is their spokesman, their orator, and his name is Tertullus. Well, they, Luke says, laid before the governor, before Felix, their case against Paul. In verse 2, let's continue on. When he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, Paul, saying, "Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made in this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you'll be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. Now, there are a few accusations that are made here, but it's interesting to me to hear the way this spokesman or this orator presents his case to Felix. Notice he doesn't go into great detail about any kind of evidence or proof that they may have, but rather he is simply trying to appease the attitude or the conceitedness, as it were, of Felix. He's wanting Felix to think about himself, to realize that these accusers are exalting Felix and he's really trying to make Felix feel good about himself. That's really the point that's being made here. And so he's talking about how much peace they're enjoying, and all of this is because of the most excellent Felix, all these reforms that are being made. We enjoy these so much, and we don't want to detain you. We don't want to take your time. We know you're a busy man. You're a very high and lofty individual. We don't want to consume any more of your time. And so here's really what we think. He's a plague. He stirs up the crowds. He's a ringleader of the Nazarenes. And we just think if you would talk to him yourself, you would be able to get to the bottom of all of these accusations that are being made. And that's really the extent of what Tertullus has to say. And so you can almost see the flattery that is pouring out of these words of Tertullus toward Felix. And I wonder if Felix is able to see through this a little bit. We're going to see a hint of something later in the chapter that may suggest that Felix does in fact like the way that Tertullus is speaking to him. So let's look at verse 9 and following. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I do confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation, should they have anything against me, or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Paul says, that's what I said. And so that much is true. I did say that. Paul's letting Felix know this. Now, it's interesting to me how how the flattery of Tertullus is not so much echoed by Paul, though Paul, as he begins to make his defense, does recognize how for many years, we're told there in verse 10, you have judged over this nation. And Paul is recognizing to Felix who Felix is, and he's showing Felix that he respects his position. And so he says, look, I know that for many years you've been a judge over this nation, and so because of that, I cheerfully will make my defense to you. And so he goes on then to speak about the fact that there is nothing that can be proven with regard to these accusations that they are making concerning him. Certainly we know from our previous study that those that were accusing Paul were doing so under false pretenses. They just didn't like Paul, and they didn't really appreciate the fact that Paul was drawing people away from their authority, really. And so Paul is very clear in his defense of himself that he was not stirring up the crowds. He was not trying to create havoc in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. He was very respectful. And I love the fact that when you see in verse 18, Paul says, when they found me doing this, when they found me coming to pay tribute and to make an offering to my nation, to my God in this temple, they found me, he says, purified. That means that Paul was ready, had consecrated himself, at least in the sense of the old law. He was purified. He was in a spiritual state with an attitude that one would need in order to approach God. And so they found him purified in the temple. There was no crowd that was being stirred up by him. There was no tumult that was being put forth by him, but rather he was coming to do just what all the others were doing, and that is to bring alms and to present his offering. Others were doing that as well. Paul saying, I was doing the very same thing that all of these other people were doing. And they didn't find me stirring up the crowds. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say, those Jews from Asia, they ought to be here to make these accusations, because the reality is, as we know from our study, the reality is the Jews from Asia are the ones that were following behind Paul. They were the ones that were stirring up the crowds against Paul. And it's because of their disruption of the things that were going on in the temple that Paul was dragged out of the temple with the gates closed behind and then beaten within an inch of his life before you had the tribune and the soldiers come up and stop it. And so Paul is saying they are the ones that ought to be here. If they have something against me, they ought to be here making these accusations. But as it is, the accusations that are being brought against me right now, they are false accusations. There's no proof, Paul says. And so he tells them, here's what I did say. I did tell them that it's with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. Now, if we keep going on in this, we see that Felix desires to keep Paul in custody. And so let's read down through the end of the chapter, verse 22 and following. But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he, Paul, should be kept in custody, but have liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Now, that last statement there of verse 27 is the statement that I was hinting at, that it may be that Felix really does like the way that Tertullus was speaking to him with regard to the flattery that was stated toward Felix. I think Felix probably liked having favor with the Jews. They probably supplied for some of his needs. Some monetary gifts were likely given to him. We don't know that for sure, but considering what Luke says just prior to this, that Felix was hoping to get some money from Paul, so he called on him often. It may very well be that Felix was accustomed to getting money from the Jews, and so to have favor with them, Felix left Paul in prison. The interesting aspect about this is, one, Felix has some sympathy on Paul. He says, give him some liberty. He needs to be kept in custody. Give him some liberty, and don't prevent any of his friends from coming to him, from attending to his needs. And it was their responsibility to go and to provide food and clothing and blankets and that sort of thing for anyone that was in prison. It was the people from the outside that would supply that. The jail would not supply that. And so Felix is saying, don't prevent them from coming and tending to his needs. And then Felix and his wife, who incidentally Luke tells us was Jewish, they come and listen to Paul as he reasons, Luke says, about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. Now, this is the part where Felix, having listened to him, we're told is afraid. And I wonder what makes him afraid or alarmed, as the ESV says. It may very well be that Felix is coming to realize his own state, and it worries him. It scares him a little bit, but he pushes it away. And so he tells Paul, go away for now, and when I have an opportunity, I will summon you again. We know that Luke tells us then that he does in fact summon him again, but we're not told that Felix ever obeys the gospel. But Luke tells us that Paul is very clear that he is speaking about faith in Christ Jesus. He's reasoning with him about righteousness, self-control, and the coming judgment. And we would understand from the other teachings of Paul that he would not have left out the plan of salvation to Felix, telling him and explaining to him what one must do to become a Christian. Well, Felix seems to push that away, and to satisfy his own greed, he continues to summon Paul, hoping that Paul will give him some money. And then Felix, we're told, after 2 years had elapsed. So from the time that Paul came into Jerusalem and went to the temple to worship that day when those Jews from Asia incited the crowd against him, from that time until the time when Paul is making the defense in chapter 24, it had been 12 days. So not much time had elapsed. So less than 2 weeks. Paul had been in Jerusalem. He had been beaten. He had been held in custody by the tribune, who then sent him to Caesarea to Felix. And now, after 5 days of waiting there, his accusers arrive, and this is day 12. Paul says in verse 11, you can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I was in Jerusalem to worship. So it's only been 12 days, but now by the end of chapter 24, 2 years now have passed since that day that he made a defense for himself. And it's not as though he's released at this point, because Luke tells us that when Festus succeeds Felix, Felix decides to leave Paul in prison. And so that's what we have in chapter 24. Chapter 24, again, the caption is Felix with the letter X. Next week we will be breaking. As a matter of fact, for the next 2 weeks we will not be looking at Acts. But we will, the week after, Lord willing, the week after Thanksgiving, we will continue with Acts chapter 25. For the next 2 weeks, I hope you'll be tuning in for a devotional thought and a brief study. But as I said, we will postpone our study of Acts until the Wednesday following Thanksgiving. Again, thank you for joining us for this series, and I hope that you've been encouraged. And I want to encourage you to dig a little bit deeper into this chapter and go ahead and read ahead into Acts chapter 25 and see the progression of Paul's time in prison. Hope you have a good evening.